$15 million is exactly what the US government offered just to find out where he was sleeping. And for 30 years, the DEA, the CIA, and the FBI found absolutely nothing, because he understood one crucial thing that every powerful man before him had missed. The most dangerous thing you can be is invisible. His name was Mencho, and his $50 billion empire actually starts in an avocado field. Born on July 17, 1966, in a village called Culotitlan, buried deep in the mountains of Michoacán, the locals called this region Tierra Caliente, or the Hot Land, famous for exactly two things: avocados and poverty. As one of 6 brothers, Nemesio's family worked the fields, picking avocados and limes or whatever the season gave them, and when the harvest was good, they ate, but when it wasn't, they simply didn't. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade, not because he was stupid, but because his family desperately needed another pair of hands in the dirt. Now, some people hear that and think the system failed him, with no education, no options, and no exit, while others hear it and think he made his own choices from day one and owns every consequence. But keep both of those ideas in your head, because this story is going to pressure test both of them. By 14, he'd already graduated from picking avocados to guarding marijuana plantations in the nearby hills, which isn't a dramatic pivot in Tierra Caliente, it's just the next job that pays, since the cartels were the only employer that showed up on time every single time. But Michoacán wasn't big enough for what Nemesio was thinking, so in the early 1980s, he did exactly what hundreds of thousands of young Mexican men did and crossed the US border illegally as a teenager, with no money, no English, and no plan. He ended up in San Francisco, and that city was about to give him the most expensive education of his life, not in drugs and not in money, but in how power actually works when nobody's watching.
San Francisco of the 1980s was not the polished tech city it would become. It was gritty, divided, and absolutely flooded with drugs. For a young man with no papers, no English, and no legal way to earn a paycheck, the streets had a very direct economy where you didn't need a resume, you just needed nerve. And here's the part nobody actually wants to say out loud, because for someone in Nemesio's position, the street economy wasn't irrational, it was actually the most rational decision available. The legitimate economy had absolutely no door open for him, while the street economy had one door always open with no paperwork required, and whether that makes it right or wrong is entirely your call. In May of 1986, at 19 years old, he was arrested by San Francisco police on drugs charges, and his booking photo showed a blue hoodie and a hard stare that didn't look like a man who planned to be rehabilitated. He was deported back to Mexico, but he came back, was arrested again, went back and came back again because the border was just a revolving door and Nemesio walked through it every single time. By 1992, he was running heroin across the Bay Area and Sacramento, moving serious weight for serious money. One night, his older brother Abraham walked into a bar called the Imperial to close a deal for 5 ounces of heroin for $9,500, while Nemesio came along as the lookout, and he immediately noticed something wrong. The buyers paid with a perfectly neat, uniform stack of $100 bills, not loose cash or a bag of money, but a clean, counted, banded stack, exactly the kind of stack that comes from an evidence room and not a drug corner. He got Abraham on the phone immediately, on a line the DEA was already recording, and told him, "These men are cops, do not deal with them." He was right since they were DEA undercover agents, but it didn't matter and both brothers were arrested anyway. Abraham got 10 years, while Nemesio got 5, serving 3 in a federal prison in Texas before being deported back to Mexico in 1995. He was 30 years old with a federal conviction, no money, no empire, and absolutely nothing. Most people in that position accept the story is over, and honestly, most people reading about this right now would have accepted it too, because the maths just doesn't work anymore. But Nemesio went home and did something that literally nobody who knew him saw coming. He applied to be a police officer. And before you laugh at that, you need to understand that that badge wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't desperation. It was actually the smartest move he ever made, because what he learned wearing it is the exact reason a $50 billion empire eventually had his name on it.
Now, this is the part of the story that actually changes everything. Here is the part most people miss, and it's the absolute key to understanding everything that came after. He didn't put on that badge because he went straight. He put it on because in Mexico, the line between law enforcement and organized crime was not a wall, it was a door, and he needed to know exactly how that door opened. Think about that for a second, because there are two completely different ways to read the same man here. In one version, a broken institution created him, but in another, he walked right into that institution and completely used it. And which one makes him more dangerous is entirely for you to decide. He served as a municipal police officer in Cabo Corrientes and Tomlatlan, which are two small towns in Jalisco, and for years he simply watched. He watched which commanders were on the cartel payroll, which routes were officially protected, how evidence disappeared from lockups, and exactly how informants got identified and dealt with. He wasn't actually working, he was studying methodically and patiently, building a complete mental map of every single vulnerability in the system he would one day need to completely outmaneuver. And when he had learned absolutely everything that badge could teach him, he quietly took it off, walked right through that door, and never looked back. He joined the Milenio cartel as a hitman, serving as just a foot soldier protecting a drug lord named Armando Valencia Cornelio, known as El Maradona. He was not yet El Mencho, and he was not yet anything really, just another armed man at the very bottom of someone else's organization. But he was always watching, and he was always waiting. And the men above him had absolutely no idea that the most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest one. What happened next wasn't ambition, it wasn't violence, and it wasn't even luck. It was actually a wedding.
The Mexican cartel world in the early 2000s had one gravitational center, and that was the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo. Everyone else was either aligned with them, working under them, or trying very hard not to get crushed by them. Nemesio embedded himself inside that universe and studied it the way a student studies for an exam he knows determines his entire future. In 2003, his boss, El Maradona, was arrested. Another man's world collapses, and another man's opportunity opens. Nemesio moved upward, attaching himself to Ignacio Coronel Villarreal, Nacho Coronel, El Chapo's primary banker, the drug lord of Jalisco. He was now watching how the biggest operation in Mexico actually ran: the money flows, the supply chains, the political relationships, the enforcement structure. And then he made the smartest move of his life. He got married. Now, most people hear cartel marriage and think love story or forced alliance. This was actually neither. This was a corporate merger executed by a man who understood that in this world, family wasn't personal, family was infrastructure. Rosalinda González Valencia. Her brother was Abigail González Valencia, head of one of the most powerful money laundering organizations in Mexico, Los Queenies. With that wedding, Nemesio didn't just gain a wife, he gained a financial infrastructure, a laundering network, and 18 siblings whose loyalty came built into the deal. Then, in 2010, Nacho Coronel was killed in a military raid. Another boss gone, another vacuum opened. This is exactly the moment that separates two kinds of people. Some men see a vacuum and look for the next boss to attach themselves to. Others see a vacuum and step into it themselves. Every person watching this right now falls into one of those two categories, and you already know which one you are. Nemesio stepped into it himself. This time, it was his name on the door. And what he built next, the structure, the systems, the actual financial architecture of it, is unlike anything any cartel had ever constructed before. Because he didn't build a cartel, he built a corporation.
In 2009, with a small group of trusted men and his brother-in-law's financial network behind him, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes founded the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the CJNG. And that name was actually a statement, meaning we are not the old way, we are simply what comes next. and he built it entirely differently from every cartel that came before him. Where El Chapo built loyalty through personal relationships and his own magnetic personality, El Mencho built systems. He created an actually massive franchise structure with 90 semi-independent sub-organizations spread across Mexico, each feeding money and loyalty upward and each running its own territory without needing him present. The machine ran without him in the room, and that's not how cartels had ever operated. That is exactly how corporations operate. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the story gets genuinely staggering. The drugs were the foundation, with fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and pipelines running into every major American city. But the fentanyl supply chain he built was something else entirely, and it was simply unprecedented. The raw precursor chemicals came from China, specifically from small private Chinese chemical companies operating openly on e-commerce platforms, and they listed chemicals for sale to absolutely anyone who knew what to search for, which the DEA called an unlimited and endless supply. Container ships left Hong Kong and Shanghai, they arrived at Mexican Pacific ports, and CJNG crews collected the shipments to move them to labs in Jalisco. His own son, El Menchito, supervised production labs that the US government says produced over 1,000 metric tons of methamphetamine. When El Menchito was finally sentenced in US federal court in March 2025, the judge ordered him to forfeit exactly $6 billion from one family member and one part of the operation. But here is what most people completely miss about El Mencho, and it is the thing that actually made him different from every drug lord in history. He didn't just run drugs, he diversified like a CEO who understood that depending on one revenue stream is a massive vulnerability. Fuel theft was huge, with CJNG crews tapping directly into Pemex petroleum pipelines across Mexico for hundreds of millions annually, and none of it crossed a border or touched foreign law enforcement. Extortion was next, because every avocado farmer in Michoacán, every business owner in Jalisco, and every local politician in CJNG territory paid a monthly fee. It wasn't a choice, it was simply a condition of continued existence. Then came the timeshare fraud, with professional call centers in Puerto Vallarta cold-calling elderly American and Canadian tourists, and the pitch was simply, "We have a buyer for your timeshare." There was no buyer, and there was no deal. It was just retirees in Florida and Minnesota wiring their life savings to a shell company in Jalisco, and the US Treasury sanctioned this operation 6 separate times. Real estate, cryptocurrency, and Chinese money laundering networks moving cartel cash through exchanges made it appear to come from legitimate commerce. When you add all of it up, the DEA's own estimate is $50 billion in total assets. I want you to sit with that number for a second and ask yourself, at what point does this stop being a criminal organization and start looking like something that looks a lot more like a government? A former DEA agent who spent years hunting El Mencho said it best. He said it's so diversified. He's got investments, he's got hotels, and he's got passive income. Passive income. The DEA describing a cartel boss in the exact language of a wealth manager. He built all of this from an avocado field and a criminal record in California, and through all of it, 30 years of building the most powerful criminal organization on earth, absolutely nobody could find him. Nobody could even confirm what he looked like beyond a 20-year-old booking photo of a teenager in a blue hoodie. That invisibility was his greatest weapon, and it was also the exact thing that was quietly killing him.
This is exactly what separates El Mencho from every single cartel boss in history. Where El Chapo escaped from maximum security prison twice, gave a secret interview to Sean Penn, showed up at parties and absolutely loved being El Chapo. That exact love of being seen is precisely what got him caught, because there's a version of power that desperately needs to be witnessed and needs the story told while you're still in it. And then there's a version of power that deeply understands that the exact moment you need people to know your name is the moment you've already started losing. El Mencho chose the second version, and in over 30 years running one of the most powerful criminal organizations on earth, he appeared on camera exactly 0 times, with no interviews, no appearances, and no social media, choosing instead to communicate entirely through layers of intermediaries, where each layer knew exactly what it needed to know.
The DEA, with all of its resources, literally described him as a ghost with an army. But every ghost has a weakness, and his was simply his own body. By his late 50s, El Mencho was in the advanced stages of chronic kidney disease, meaning he needed dialysis equipment, he needed specialists, and he needed medication delivered on a highly precise schedule, and you simply cannot disappear completely when massive machines are required just to keep you alive. DDA analysts and Mexican military intelligence began quietly tracking shipments of specialized medical equipment moving into the mountains of southern Jalisco, where they found an associate, watched that associate, and let that associate lead them directly to a woman who actually knew where he was. On February 20th, 2026, they watched her travel to a gated mountain community in Tapalula, Jalisco, where she visited, she left, and he stayed. And exactly 2 days later, 6 helicopters rose over the mountains at dawn. He didn't get caught because he slipped up in business, and he didn't get caught because someone took the $15 million bounty. He actually got caught simply because someone who loved him showed up to see him, meaning 30 years of absolute perfect silence was entirely undone by a single visit. When the helicopters finally came down over Tapalula, he was already a very sick man, and after being shot in the raid, he never even regained consciousness on the flight to Mexico City. There was no trial, no perp walk, and absolutely no courtroom. The most wanted man on earth just quietly went to sleep, exactly the way he always lived. But the empire he built certainly didn't.
Within hours of his death, the CJNG responded with the most coordinated display of criminal power in modern Mexican history, featuring 250 roadblocks across 20 states, burning vehicles on federal highways, and a car bomb that killed a National Guard captain. A bounty was placed on the head of every single soldier in uniform, resulting in 25 members of the National Guard killed in a single afternoon. While Guadalajara was completely shut down, international flights were cancelled, and 1,000 tourists were trapped at the Guadalajara Zoo. The world simply watched Mexico burn and asked the exact question that every government had been quietly dreading. What actually happens to a $50 billion empire when the man who built it dies? The answer to that question actually splits people into 2 camps. Some say the machine simply collapses without the architect because power structures built around one person always eventually do, while others say he built it specifically to survive him, leaving behind 90 semi-independent organizations that are all armed, all profitable, and none of them needing a boss to actually function. Which version is right matters significantly more than you might think, because if it's the second one, then what those governments just eliminated wasn't actually the threat, it was just the face of it. Look at his family. His son, El Menchito, was given a life sentence with $6 billion in forfeiture. His wife, Rosalinda, was arrested. His daughter, Jessica, was arrested for money laundering, and his son-in-law pled guilty to an international money laundering conspiracy. Meanwhile, his brother-in-law, Abigail, who built the entire financial arm, was extradited to the United States to face charges in Washington, D.C., and his brother, known as El Tony Montana, was arrested in Guadalajara in 2022. Every single family member who ever touched the operation is currently sitting in a prison cell, and yet compliance officers in banks across 40 countries are right now being told to watch for unusual wire transfers. Shell companies that were dormant for years are suddenly showing activity, and real estate transactions in Mexico, Uruguay, Argentina, and Southeast Asia are being flagged and placed under investigation, because the money still needs to move, and the empire still exists. It's simply leaderless. He came into this world in a dirt-poor village in Michoacan, picking avocados and dreaming of something more. He crossed a border illegally. He sold heroin in a San Francisco bar. He went to prison. He got deported. He wore a police badge he never actually believed in, and he studied every single system that was supposed to stop him before using absolutely every single one of them. And when they finally found him, it wasn't satellites, it wasn't the $15 million bounty, and it wasn't 30 years of intelligence gathering. It was actually just someone who loved him enough to show up.
Was he simply a product of a system that gave him no options, or did he look at every option available and consciously choose the one that cost the most people the most pain? Honestly, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, and I think that is exactly the part that makes this story completely impossible to fully close, because the ghost was human after all.